So hi everybody, I'm Alicia Searles, I'm the Community Nature Advisor for Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust. Also on this call we've got Lucy Graham, Communities Officer for Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust, and we've got Dr. Alex Dittrich, Senior Lecturer in Zoology from Nottingham Trent University. So this is the What's Flowering on Your Street online training, and it's brought to you by Nature Recovery Sheffield. That's the project that me and Lucy work on, and it forms part of the City Nature Challenge, which is a global BioBlitz taking part this weekend. So we're part of over 700 cities taking part worldwide, and we'll be recording wild plants and animals spotted in one weekend using our recording platform, Nature Counts. So I'll put some links in the chat if you're not aware of it already. So as I said, it was brought to you by the Nature Recovery Sheffield project, and which is a community organising approach which enables groups to take meaningful actions for nature's recovery on their doorstep and in their communities. If you require help and support, please check out our resources pages on our website, log your actions for nature's recovery, and put them on our community action map. And I'll provide some links in the chat about this later. So I'll just pass you over to Lucy now. She'll start and talk to you a little bit more about what we're doing.
Welcome everyone. Just first, a big shout out to our funders, the Lottery Community Fund, and big thank you to our supporters and community groups and members. I'd just like to introduce you to the incredible Alex, who gave us an amazing training session on insects yesterday, which is his full-time career and passion, right, Alex? But also part-time botanist. And also very knowledgeable on the plants, which is what brought you all to us today. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to this training course on a little introduction to, if you've ever wondered what that plant is that you're going past on your park, your street, in your garden, and hand you over to Alex. Thank you, Alex.
Pleasure. Right, let me just share my slides. Share. You should be able to see my screen now. Okay, people see that? We can see that, yes.
Can see that. Oh, sorry, awesome. One thing, Alex, before I forget, if anyone's got any questions, pop them in the chat and we'll have a look at them at the end. A quick Q&A session at the end. Sorry, Alex, go ahead.
Hi. So, my name's Alex Dittrich. I'm a senior lecturer in zoology, as Lucy was saying. I'm part of the School of Animal, Rural Environmental Science at Nottingham Trent University, where I'm based at the Brackenhurst campus, if anyone gets the opportunity to visit. It's a lovely little rural campus that's got fantastic grounds there, lots of opportunity to see wildlife, plants. We've got bird hides, ponds, field margins, some lovely hedgerows. It's a really, really nice campus, and it is there is a lovely coffee shop that's open to the public there. So if you're in the vicinity, do pop in and see the campus. This is me in my natural habitat, working in the field there, actually doing some insect surveys. But you don't get insects without the plants. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got here and give you an overview. So, why are my slides not progressing? There we go. So, simple overview of this talk. I'm just going to talk about where we can find plants, what plants are useful, and how to ID. So I'm going to go through some really simple identification characteristics of common plants that you should see from now until the end of the summer. Particularly, these are things that you should be keeping an eye out for on your challenge this weekend that I hope you'll sign up for, because one of the things that we need in order to conserve these habitats is really good citizen science data. If you're providing that data by doing these identification exercises, if you're going out there, you're finding things and you're recording them, then it helps us know what's doing well, maybe what's doing less well, where we need to target our conservation efforts, how we need to target our management, and basically the state of nature. So it doesn't matter how common something is, it's really, really important that you record it. More often than not, there is a disparity between things that are rare and exciting being recorded versus a shortfall on records of those common things. So it's really, really important that we're always out there and we're always recording, okay? There are a lot of apps that you can get on your mobile device for recording plants and animals, and I would encourage everybody to just use them all the time, not just with activities like what we've got going on this weekend. Okay, so how did I get there? So myself, as Lucy said, I'm really an insect guy. My PhD, interestingly, was on leafhoppers and plant hoppers, if you've ever seen them. And I was very interested in a particularly rare species, which is called Rhabautodelphax imitans. Now, this insect, at the time of my PhD, was only known from a very few sites in the UK, and nothing was known about its autoecology. Nothing was understood really about the host plants that it was feeding on, or indeed any of its needs within that matrix of plants that it lives within. Okay, so that was basically what I did throughout that PhD, and my PhD involved an awful lot of plant ID. Now, this here is a lovely little diagram. It takes an awful lot of work to produce something like this, but also it gives you a lovely result at the end that looks very pretty. Okay, this is what's referred to as a bipartite network. Okay, at the top here we have insects. These are all leafhoppers or plant hoppers. They're related to a Rhabautodelphax imitans. And on the bottom here we have plants. In fact, all of these plants are grasses or sedges. Okay. And the lines illustrate the relationships that each of these insect species on the top has with these plants. So if you see a thick line here, right, that means lots of individuals are feeding on this plant here. So Arthaldus pasqualis here is feeding on Holcus lanatus, this grass. And there's quite a lot of them feeding on it, so it's got quite a thick line. But you can see that there's lots of other lines that are joining up here, which shows that this insect species is dependent on a lot of different grass species. But also, conversely, if you look at things like this one here, so Psychedella viridis, for example, it is only found on this species. So we have a combination of insects out there in the world that either can feed on a lot of different plants or very, very few plants. They're either a specialist or they're a generalist. And understanding what plants we have and what kind of community structure we have gives us a really, really good picture of what the wider environment looks like, what the wider community looks like. Because we all know that, you know, without plants, we wouldn't have insects, and without insects, we wouldn't have plants, okay? Everything is very dependent on each other. So, with that in mind, I'm just opening with this point here. When is a weed a weed? Now, I hate the word weed because everything that is growing out there in the wild when you're on that walk is there because the environment is right for it. For every dandelion that you see coming up from the pavement, the environment is just perfect for that plant, and that's why it's found there, you know. Those plants that we see, those native plants, were here long before we had our cultivated gardens. They are part of the natural landscape, and we've done an awful lot to change what that landscape looks like. Okay, so it's really, really important that we kind of switch off that kind of mindset when we're looking for plants, right? We're not looking for cultivars, we're not looking for exciting ornamental species. We're looking to see what we have and where we find it. Right, so I'm going to talk to you about these four groups. Okay, we're talking about trees, shrubs, grasses, and forbs. Okay, so trees are basically your big things. Okay, shrubs, your not so big things. Okay, your grasses, things that you find typically on grasslands and lawns, and then your forbs, which is everything else, your sort of flowering plants, right? So we're talking about these four groups, and I'm going to give you some examples from each of these groups that you can hopefully go out and identify. I'm sure a lot of people on this call will be more than aware of some of these species that I'm going to show you, but you should be keeping an eye out for them because that data, as I said, is really, really useful. It's really useful for the wildlife trusts for informing their management decisions and their conservation. Okay. So how can you tell the difference between these? Okay, so a tree typically has a single woody trunk with branches that form above the ground. They branch off. That's why they're called branches. Okay. Grasses typically have parallel veins, right? Narrow leaves, and they don't have obvious flowers. Okay. Your forbs have a soft stem. Okay. They're not woody, and they're typically dying back each year at varying degrees. Some forbs will die back completely in the winter. Some will die back a little bit. Some will die back at the end of the spring. But for the most part, they're dying back. And then you have your shrubs, which have woody stems, much like the trees, but they have several stems that sprout out from ground level, as opposed to the tree that have that single stem. Okay, single woody stem, tree, multiple woody stems, a shrub. Okay, forbs, soft stems, grasses, narrow leaves. Okay, if you can remember those characteristics, don't worry, I don't have a test at the end of this training. Okay, you're pretty good at identifying these groups. I will say that trees are fairly easy to identify. Winter and spring, you can identify them, but based on slightly different characteristics. They're also very, very charismatic. They're large, they're quite easy to find. The grasses are probably the most challenging of the groups. When I was doing my PhD, I spent an awfully long time trying to identify grasses, and I really struggled. So I had to pull in a lot of experts a lot of the time. Shrubs, similarly to trees, can be quite straightforward to identify. The forbs, however, being the most diverse of the groups, can also provide a real challenge for you, but perhaps not so much as the grasses, okay, because those features that the forbs have are somewhat more distinct, especially when you look at their flowers, okay. The flowers, those unique characteristics that are associated with the forbs that are possibly less obvious with the grasses. And when we talk about speciosity, the number of species within the UK, the UK has what we would refer to as a depauperate fauna. That is a posh word, a depauperate flora, rather, which is a posh word for having fewer species than you would maybe see in the rest of the world. Okay, so trees, we have only 30 to 35 native tree species with 180 established. So you can see that the majority of tree species that we have in the UK are non-native. This, when you compare it to the global estimates of around 73,000, it's quite a small number of trees. Shrubs, we have about 300. When you compare that to 40,000 odd that we have globally, again, a small number. We only have 150 species of grass versus the global number of 12,000. And when we look at forbs, we're into kind of silly figures here. So 1,800 to 2,000-ish compared to 2.6 to 300,000. So we've got really, really big disparities here. The most interesting figure here, I would say, is when you look at the trees, okay? The fact that we've got 180 tree species, but the majority of those being non-native is really worrying because non-native species they don't have the same associations with insects, with other native animal species that you see with our native species. Okay, over the millions of years that they've been on this planet, those relationships between the host, the tree, and the species that relies on it have become very, very tight. They become very dependent upon each other. And as soon as you introduce a non-native plant into that environment, it throws the whole system off, okay? All those lovely caterpillars that are used to feeding on the native trees that we have in the UK, you introduce a non-native there, they've got nothing to feed on. It disrupts the whole ecosystem. And you can look at that when you see things like birds, right? Classic example of an urban bird, and there's been lots of research on this. Your blue tits, for example, blue tit being the archetypal urban bird species. In areas where there is more non-native tree species, you have a much, much more significant die-off of young in the spring than you would in a habitat which has more native tree species. And that is solely because those trees aren't supporting that body of insect life that they need to feed their young. Okay, so native is good. Okay, I'm pitching to you as people in the UK that have your own gardens. If you get the opportunity to plant some trees in your garden, plant native. You know, even better if you can plant native forbs as well. There are some really pretty species out there. So just be conscientious and get those native species in. So yes, the main issue with the native and non-native plants is this idea of non-native and managed habitats. The host plant associations just aren't there. Now, I mentioned trees. Another really brilliant example of this is the nettle. If we look at the nettle, these are all species of insect that are completely dependent upon nettle as a host plant. When we look at things like red admiral larvae, peacock larvae, microlophium, the aphids that feed on nettle, these provide amazing, abundant food source in the spring for our native bird species and our small mammals. If you remove nettle from your habitat, these species have got nowhere to go because it's literally the only thing that they'll feed on. So really important, keep things native, keep things messy. We're like a messy garden. So let's make a start on some species. So what I've done is I've grouped forbs, grasses, trees, shrubs into sections within this presentation. I'm going to talk through them in order. I'm going to give you a few examples and how to identify them as we go through, okay? No need to make notes. This is being recorded, as you know, and you get access to the recording afterwards. So Quercus robur, possibly one of the most important species that we have within the UK, the English oak. Unfortunately, it is a species that we have far fewer of than we had several hundred years ago. It is a species that takes an awful long time to reach maturity, and it is important in all stages of its life, okay? This tree, it's been said, takes 400 years to grow up, 400 years to get old, and 400 years to die, right? Even when this tree is dying, it is hugely important for wildlife, okay? So that's a long time. That's a 1,200-year life cycle. Yeah, so 1,200 is a really long time. 1,200 years is a long time to be alive. And unfortunately, that's a lot of investment. Every oak tree that we have in the UK is tremendously valuable, okay? There are some species of non-native oaks that have been introduced into the UK, but this is the important one, Quercus robur. You can identify it because it has these simple lobed leaves. These lobed leaves are sort of rounded, they're not pointed like the turkey oak. They have acorns that are shaped like this, very, very rough bark, okay? Species such as the leaf roller caterpillar are completely dependent upon the oak. Some bird species such as jay, hugely dependent upon the acorns as a food source, as are numerous species of small mammal that feeds on the acorns. It's also important to note that species such as your tawny owl will utilize mature oaks as a nesting source. If we lost these trees in our landscape, our lovely tawny owls would have nowhere to go. Now, the silver birch is a very different species to our oak. It's really, really important in terms of the species that feed on it. There are several aphids that feed on it abundantly. Siskins will also feed on the seeds. They'll also feed on the aphids to feed their young. Moth caterpillars and lots of dead wood insects will use the decaying wood. Now, I say that the birch is very, very different to the oak because it has a very, very short life cycle. This is a very, very live fast, die young tree. It grows very, very quickly and it doesn't live a very long time relative to the oak trees, okay? But when it dies, you have a tremendously useful resource in that dead wood. Okay, you can identify it because it's got this white peeling bark. It has typical kind of triangular leaves. You often see lots of stands like this of the oak trees, of the birch trees, growing quite close together. Okay, I'm sure we can all identify silver birch, but it is a very, very important tree. Add it to your records. Other species that you might find in urban habitat, things like rowan, hugely important source for numerous frugivorous birds, or birds that feed on fruit, as are useful for small mammals and pollinating insects that feed on the flowers. Now, these have what are referred to as pinnate leaves. So if you see the leaves in these clusters like this, with this kind of like rough edges, they have these kind of pinnate form, but with the berry clusters coupled with them, that's definitely a rowan species. Rowan is a very, very useful plant species. The ash, Fraxinus excelsior, this is another tree species that is incredibly threatened in the UK from disease, from ash dieback. So we're losing a lot of ash, but ash is really, really important. Again, there are numerous species that are completely dependent on this. It's a really great crop for numerous insects that then feed other higher vertebrates. We see things such as the ash bud moth, which feeds on just the buds of the ash tree. In the winter, it's quite easy to identify because it has black buds. Okay, when the buds break, they have these lovely pinnate leaves like this that kind of sit opposite each other. So the buds sit right opposite each other. They're black in color and they have these pinnate leaves. Now let's talk about some shrubs. Now there's some real firm favorites in here. Okay, the blackthorn, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, Prunus spinosa, unsurprisingly has black thorns. Beautiful white flowers, which you should see at the moment in some areas if they haven't gone over already. And when it fruits later in the year, you have these beautiful berries, okay? Things such as the brown hair streak caterpillar will feed on the leaves. The bullfinches responsible for chewing on the buds. Hugely important for mammals that feed on the sloes, but also the flowers providing nectar for early insects. So bees that come out early in the year, they're really dependent upon blackthorn as a nectary source. For those of you that are interested in making sloe gin as well, get out there, make yourself a bit of sloe gin. But I would say this, be conscientious. You're not the only person that wants a go on this crop. So save some for the birds. It's really, really important. But again, very, very easy to identify here. The thorny branches, a bit of a giveaway. If you've got leaves that shape like this, with these kind of like off blue berries, you've got a blackthorn. Elder, Sambucus, typically a tree that can be very invasive in some habitats. You find it in urban areas. It's very, very common in urban areas, but it has these sort of umbelliferous type flat white flower heads that relatively early in the year become these beautiful black berries. Again, there is a number of species that are very, very dependent upon this tree. This is a very, very common tree, but it is a tree that is hugely important because of the massive nectary that's provided with its flowers. So it has an abundance of white flowers, and also the fruit that it produces afterwards. So elder is definitely one to keep an eye out for. Gorse is, that's my favorite shrub. I love it. I think it's great. Ilex europaeus has spiny green stems and yellow pea-like flowers. So its flowers look like pea flowers. It also has a beautiful scent, almost like pineapple. So if you give it a good smell, it's almost pineapple-y. This is a very, very unique shrub as well, that it will flower all year round. You'll find flowers on gorse literally all year round, which is wonderful. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important for insects that may be active in the winter. Also, this dense bush can provide nesting material, nesting resources for loads of different birds, as well as there are some highly specialist caterpillar species that will feed on it as well. So gorse is probably one of my favorites. I think they are magnificent. Lovely things, apart from when you fall in them. The hawthorn, one to keep an eye out for. The hawthorn kind of sits between a shrub and a tree. Thorny branches, deeply load leaves, white spring flowers. So if you see this huge inflorescence of white flowers in the spring, it's likely to be a hawthorn. Hawthorn is one of those shrub species rather, that is important for the dormouse as well. So if you're interested in small mammals, the dormouse is just about as rare as it gets for a UK mammal. So it's one of those species that's really, really important. If we didn't have hawthorns, we wouldn't have dormice, and I'm sure I get told off for saying this. They're very cute. As somebody who normally would identify as a zoologist, the word cute is banned in my scientific circles. I always get chastised for saying cute. Okay, but I do. I think they're cute. Right, now onto the grasses. Grasses are very, very hard to identify. Okay, but there are a few that you can pick out in a lineup. Okay, there are a few that you can pick out in a lineup, and there's a few here that I'm just going to talk you through to see whether you can remember some characteristics here. So lolly and peren is the perennial ryegrass. Okay, when it's flowering, it has these kind of opposite buds like this that give it away, that look like some commercial crops, some commercial rye crops. Okay. It has no side branches on its flowering spikes, so it just comes up in one kind of spear like this. Okay. If you look at the leaf underneath, as well as you can see from that tussock, it's very shiny underneath. Okay, so it's very, very shiny on its underside. So if it's flowering and its leaves are like this and they're shiny, you have perennial ryegrass. And if you can identify perennial ryegrass from, say, for example, your fescues, you're already an expert. Okay, that will impress your friends when you're out. Okay, if you can identify that, you will impress your friends. They're useful for a number of species. As you know, rabbits, field voles, things like this will be feeding on them, but perhaps less known species such as meadow grasshoppers, leafhoppers, and plant hoppers will also feed on the sap of these grasses. Okay, so perennial ryegrass, keep an eye out for that one. I want to see lots of records of that. The cocksfoot, Dactylus glomerata. This is a very tufty type plant with a triangular stem. So if you look at the stem, it is triangular in shape. Okay. And it has these unusually lumpy kind of flower heads. So when you see the flower heads kind of clustered like this, that have a sort of kind of weird, like lumpy kind of texture, that is your cocksfoot. Okay. Very, very strange name. but there it is. Okay, this is one to keep an eye out for. Possibly later in the year, it's easy to identify when it flowers. So June, July. So you're talking in a month to 8 weeks time, it will start flowering like that. If you're feeling very, very adventurous, you can identify them before they flower. But grasses are tricky to identify before they flower. Now, false oat grass, Arenatherium, looks like oat. Okay, so if you see a grass with its flower head that looks like this, that looks like a crop of oats, and one that has particularly swollen stems, so it's kind of its stem. Is it possible for me to actually annotate this? It's not. I'm not used to using. Oh, what's that? I'm gonna try. I'm gonna draw. Okay, so if its stem kind of looks like this, okay, you have the false oat grass. Okay, so rather than going straight up like this, it has a sort of swollen stem base. Okay, that's your false oat grass. Okay, right, moving on. Yorkshire fog, possibly one of my favorite grasses. And in fact, it's one of only two grasses I actually have a scientific paper on. So I have actually published using Yorkshire fog in a laboratory experiment. Now, this is a beautiful, beautiful grass. The flower heads are stunning, as you can see there. They have that lovely kind of like off purple kind of color, kind of gray, greeny, purpley kind of color. But if you look at the leaves are actually hairy. Okay, and the hairiness is it's kind of an interesting thing because it prevents things like insects from feeding preferentially on it. But there are certain species that will feed on it, things like cranefly larvae feeding in the roots. Grasshoppers will chew the stems, but you see perhaps less insect activity associated with this plant species. But nonetheless, it's a beauty. It's a lovely grass species, but also very common. It's quite likely that you just have it in your lawn at home. Now for some forbs. We love our forbs. We're going to end on some forbs here. So the stinging nettle, I've said this before, stinging nettle is a really, really important species, okay? Members of the nettle family you can identify because they have kind of squarish stems. So nettles, mints, and related plants have a sort of square stem like this. The nettle itself has these kind of urtications, hence the name urtica, which are obviously what gives it its stinging abilities. Its leaves are toothed like this, and they die back every year. As I said in one of my opening slides, the nettle is just about as important as a plant gets in Britain. Okay, the nettle, I cannot stress enough, is really, really important. I know it can be invasive in your garden, but I would encourage you to just be kind to nettles. If you have a small stand of nettles in your garden, it's really, really great. Okay, if you're lucky, some small tortoiseshell butterflies will visit later in the year. They'll lay some eggs on it, and it will get chomped up by their by their larvae, by their caterpillars, to hatch off to the next generation. Okay, wonderful plant species. I think they're just great. Dandelions, similarly. Okay, the plant that everyone complains about is possibly one of the most useful. Okay, the seeds provide a wonderful source of food for goldfinches. And if you've ever seen a goldfinch try and tackle the seed head of a dandelion, it's hilarious. I would absolutely recommend that you try and see this behavior if you can. They're almost always in flower as well, so they're providing a really important nectary for butterflies, for bumblebees, for lots of insects that are feeding on the nectar. The basal rosette, quite a kind of simple shape, this sort of rosette shaped flower. There's a yellow flower head, hollow stem, milky sap. There are a lot of other related species, similar species, but the common dandelion is the one that you should really keep an eye out for. It's an important plant species. And thankfully, that important plant species is quite common. Oxeye daisies, perhaps less common, but equally identifiable. If you see a large daisy-like flower, white petals, yellow center, unbranched stem, the unbranched stem being very, very important here, you've got the oxeye daisy. Lots of species, again, will feed on this. The pollen resources in oxeye daisies, very, very important for a range of insects that feed on that food source. But there are also a useful source of nectar for some pollinating insects and butterflies. Red clover, another one that I recommend people should keep in their gardens. If you can tolerate a sprawling purple inflorescence in your garden, definitely plant red clover. I love red clover. I think it's great. It's really, really useful for bumblebees. They have a particularly long proboscis or a tongue that can reach the nectary there. Common blue butterfly caterpillars will feed on the leaves. The seeds are fed on by a range of different mammals. But also as well, it provides an interesting habitat mosaic that's really useful for things such as grass snakes that will feed within that environment that's provided. So pink flower heads, trifoliate leaves, so leaves that come in threes with a little pale leaf marking on there. You've got red clover. Get it in your garden, it's great. I've got loads of it in mine. Ribwort plantain. This is quite an easy one to identify. If you see a plantain species that's got narrow leaves like this that has ribs along it there, you likely have ribwort plantain. It has a flower spike that comes up on leafless stems. So you see the flower spike there? It's coming from the main base of the plant, but it's not attached to a stem with any leaf on. It's likely you've got a plantain species. The ribwort plantain here looks a little bit like this. Numerous species will feed on it. As I said before, it's wonderful for insects, but also provides a food source for those mammals as well. Oh, what's happened here? Common poppy, one to keep an eye out for. Red petals, black center, hairy stem. Poppy loves disturbed ground. So if you're looking at brownfield sites around urban areas, it's one to keep an eye out for. Quite easy to identify when it's in flower and also when it's not. But it has a very, very short growing season. Okay, so poppies are there 1 minute and they're gone the next. But one that you should definitely keep an eye out for. Got a lovely unpronounceable scientific name there as well, which I'm not even going to attempt. Cow parsley, not to be confused with things such as hemlock water dropwort, which is possibly our most toxic plant in the country. We have cow parsley that looks very similar, but is quite benign, providing a food source for lots of insects, as well as a food source for many birds as well that will feed on the insects that live on it and also on the seed heads. So if you have white umbelliferous flowers, so umbrella-shaped flowers, as you can see there, form a little kind of umbrella-ish kind of shape like that. It has a hollow stem and leaves that are very fern-like, as you can see the leaves. They look almost like a fern's leaves, but they're not ferns. We're not going into fern identification in this session, by the way. Ferns are a whole other thing. You've likely got cow parsley, but just be mindful that there are other species that are very similar to cow parsley that are very toxic. So observe from a distance. Cleavers or sticky weed. One of everyone's favorite, coming back from school, you throw it at your friend's school jumper and it sticks on. These are lovely things. They've got hooked stems and leaves, a square stem, like you see with the nettles or the mint species. Lovely little round seeds that they've got as well. This is actually one of the edible plants. It's definitely a food for free special, this one here, the cleavers, one to keep an eye out for. But again, very, very important. There's a lot of aphid species that will feed on this. There's also some leaf beetles, which are probably one of the more charismatic beetle groups that you find within the UK. One of the prettier beetle groups will feed on cleavers. So it's one to keep an eye out for. Right, so how and where to record. Now, I have put in the chat these links. It's worth keeping an eye out on the recording platform. We've got this Wild Sheffield recording platform here. Definitely sign up to the City Nature Challenge that's coming up soon. If you can record these plant species that I have talked you through in this session, definitely try and record them. Everything here is a common species, and you should be able to find every single species and add it to that nature challenge. And it would be really, really good to kind of see the distribution of those around Sheffield. So have a look at that. There are some great resources as well on the Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust website. So there's some insect-friendly, nature-friendly gardening pages. There's some wonderful advice on how you can produce insect-friendly gardens by encouraging native plant species. So definitely have a look at that. Also, the spotter sheets. So you don't need any fancy kit. You don't need any complicated books and guides to identify these species. Most of the information that you need is on the Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust pages, where you can download these PDFs on identifying numerous species to add to your nature challenge. I just want to add at the end, again, this is a third thank you to the National Lottery Community Fund, to the Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust for hosting me this evening, and the Nature Recovery Fund. So that's me done. I will stop sharing